that this is a national emergency. You use the word emergency in your column. Why? What's your case?
Because any liberal democracy, any constitutional democracy, relies upon something we call the objective truth. Now, some politicians fib and lie. In fact, almost all of them do to some extent. But they always do it in a way that pays some sort of deference to reality. And what we've discovered is that in the last 3 weeks, this president, rather like he did on the campaign trail, simply insists that black is white, that things that we can see with our own eyes, like the size of his inauguration crowd, are not exactly what we're seeing. And he's able to command his underlings to actually go out there and also say things that are empirically untrue. This is not about politics or ideology. Like, there are some things that Trump believes in, for example, a more restrained America around the world, immigration controls, for example, that I'm sympathetic to. It's about the ability for the president to tell the truth and for us to believe it. And to have such an unstable figure incapable of accepting reality at the center of the world is an extremely dangerous thing. You said unstable. In your column, you said mentally unstable. Why do you think it's appropriate to be describing the president that way? I'm not a shrink, and if I were, I wouldn't say this anyway, because you can't diagnose someone. But I'm a human being, and I can tell if someone is saying things that we know not to be true and never corrects it. For example, that the murder rate, which is a very solid statistic, you know, there are dead bodies we can count. When he says the murder rate is the highest it's been in 45 to 47 years, what are we supposed to do, Brian? Well, what is anybody supposed to do? This is simply completely bonkers. He's saying things that do not exist. When a president is saying things like that and doesn't correct himself, has no one correct him, we have fact checkers now every day of the week compiling lists and lists and lists of things he's saying that are empirically untrue, false. Now, I don't know whether he knows they're false, but if he doesn't know they're false, then he needs to be informed. Right. If he knows they're false and still saying it's true, then, and if he doesn't know, then he shouldn't be in that office. On the point about the murder rate, I remember the day he made that false statement this week. I talked with my editors at CNN, the head of standards at CNN. We reached the conclusion that that specifically was a lie, and called it a lie because it's been corrected so many times, debunked so many times, that by now he must know the truth about the murder rate. But you're taking it a couple steps further by questioning his mental stability. And I wonder why you think that's not being said more often on television or in columns like your own. Do you feel like you're a bit alone on this issue? And if so, why? Well, I think others are picking up on it. Certainly, if you're not on camera or not writing, people are talking about this all the time. I think sometimes you want to assume that there is a rationality at the center of our entire republic, that there is someone who can listen to reason, who can see an empirical fact, who can distinguish between an opinion and a fact, between what he wants to be true and what is true. And sometimes we don't want to say that in public. We can't. But look, we're journalists, and we're trying to understand what's happening. And if we don't just simply say what's in front of our eyes, what use are we? I mean, how are we supposed to do this when someone keeps telling us untruths every day? Are you describing a failure of journalism, you think, that it's not being addressed more publicly? Well, I think the journalists have been doing a fantastic job in many ways of fact-checking. But fact-checking doesn't really capture the extent of what's going on. And I think many journalists, for good reasons, because we don't want to say something's not right here, have to conform to certain routines and procedures and norms that we used to use. And, you know, all politicians, they say, fib, they pass the truth. Phil Clinton was someone who seemed to fib all the time. But they always paid some reference to reality. And when it was pointed out, when a fact was pointed out, they would correct it. He won't correct anything. In fact, I don't think of all the hundreds and hundreds of false statements he's made, he and his spokesman have not actually retracted a single one. And you ask yourself, why? They might point to birtherism and say Trump did come out before Election Day and say President Obama was born in the U.S. That's the only example that comes to my mind of a statement that he corrected. That's true, Brian. Only, as you saw, if you saw that press conference, it was incredibly reluctant rushed and then immediately followed by another attack.
Do you worry, though, that talking about this, about his psychology, you calling him mentally unstable and delusional, do you worry that it further causes divisions in the country, makes it impossible for the people who voted for him to want to hear you out?
Of course I do. And God knows, I wish I weren't here having to say this. No one wants to be here saying this. I don't want to believe the President of the United States is just delusional or cannot accept reality. Of course not. It pains me. It gives me great pain and concern and distress. But at some point, being a writer or a journalist requires one to simply say what one is seeing in front of one's eyes. And sometimes you have to say that in plain English.
So you don't see any alternative explanations for his behavior?
Well, I do think that his ego is involved. I do think that he wants not to seem as if he's gotten something wrong. He does want to say things that advance certain policies that he wants to propose, all of which is fine. All of which is fine. But what I'm saying is if you continually do that and you never recognize reality, if you're still insisting, as he was as lately as last Friday, that there was massive voter fraud, that millions of people voted, all of whom voted for Hillary Clinton, didn't vote for him, were voting in the last election. That is simply, first of all, completely untrue. It's also deeply destructive of democratic legitimacy. And it is, to put it frankly, a little bonkers.
There's been a strain of reaction in television and in conservative media circles that all this media coverage of Trump, all this criticism of Trump, people suggesting he's unstable, it's all hysteria. Take a look at this compilation from Fox News.
You read these hysterical headlines in the media.
You got the mainstream media beating him up.
I thought there was a lot of media hysteria over the Trump executive order on the refugees.
You know, more of the same kind of hysterical hand-wringing that seems now to go on about everything that Donald Trump ever says.
He's opposed by the mainstream media.
Andrew, you calling this an emergency is going to have them saying you're being hysterical. Your reaction?
Yeah, sure. Say that. I mean, I'm happy to be called hysterical if people want to call me that. I would ask them instead, how do you explain the constant barrage of untruths, falsehoods, and lies coming out of this person? How do you explain that? And when you talk about hysteria, I'm not tweeting in the early hours of the morning in all caps. I'm not out of control in terms of tweeting every morning, noon, and night about things that are not true, violating established norms of responsible behavior in the office of the president. If there is anybody who's actually exhibiting hysteria, panic, out of controlness, it's coming from the Oval Office, not from the rest of us. Liberal democracy requires some consensus, some common facts, some common reality for us to have a really good fight over. Like we should have bare knuckles fight ideologically, politically, and everything, but we have to relate it to reality at some point, our interpretation of reality. And when the central figure in our political system is creating an entire world of unreality, how are we supposed to respond? And I think we have to respond. We have to respond by saying, excuse me, Mr. President, with all due respect, you keep telling us things that are not true. Can you please stop this? And if you can't stop it, if you simply keep asserting the world is one way when it really isn't, because everybody else can see it, then we have a serious problem at the very heart of our government. And denying that, or tiptoeing around it, or not saying it plainly, is a failure of our duty as journalists, as writers, as reporters, to say and call it as we see it.
Andrew Sullivan, thank you so much for being here this morning.
You're so welcome, Brian.